Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's webinar, 6 Enterprise Mobility Priorities of Highly Effective CIOs. My name is Glenn Johnson, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, and thank you for joining us. I'm joined today by Andy Bowie. I'd like to welcome Andy as well. And Andy will be sharing with us a demonstration at the conclusion of the initial presentation of integration, and we'll be talking about mobility as well. So we're excited about all that. And as we go into today's topic, we also wanted to just provide a brief overview of Magic Software. Magic Software is a company traded on the NASDAQ Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol MGIC, a global company with customers in over 50 nations worldwide. And we've been in business some 30 years now. So we certainly look forward to sharing our experience with you today. And we'll specifically be looking to learn how CIOs who pay very close attention to certain key success factors have been able to excel and look at these areas in terms of security and integration and scalability, skilled resources, offline connectivity, deployment management, and so on. So we'll be taking a look at all of that, and we'll be particularly paying attention to some of the things that people have in the back end of their environments in the IT world, so that we can talk about connectivity to enterprise systems for mobile applications, as well as the enterprise connectivity environment in general. So this is an open discussion in the sense that we are recording today's webinar, and we will make that recording available later for your colleagues and so forth. Also, you may ask questions, which we will be happy to take at the conclusion of the formal presentation. So using the GoToMeeting boxes up in the upper right corner, you can enter either a chat or a question, and we'll be happy to get to those as we complete the demonstration, and we'll get back and loop into your questions. But go ahead and enter them in at any time as they occur to you. We find that always works best, so you don't forget what your question was. So we wanted to begin by talking about those 6 areas. First of all, being enterprise security is really important in mobile applications, and that really fitting into existing enterprise security governance plans, and in many instances turning them upside down and changing the way that they need to work. Now, effective CIOs are those that have a Chief Information Security Officer, typically, that's been designated to overview security matters for the organization. But the CIOs we found worked very closely, were very collaborative, didn't just view this as a matter for delegation, but in fact were involved in security decisions and really building that security-oriented culture across the entire organization. So they found that detailed written plans and policies were nice, but that they were after that transformative cultural approach to security, where people are aware of and thinking about the organization's digital assets as extremely valuable, and perhaps even more important, its public reputation as depending upon effective security standards and procedures. And so the other thing that is noticed is that the regulatory environment and the compliance environment of an organization, its industry, its unique operating approach will often influence the enterprise security governance planning and approach. And the best CIOs still, however, were able to win over that board support. So despite the uniquenesses of their business, they didn't use that as an excuse to gloss over or to simply comply with the known industry requirements in particular regulated industries, but also to win support for overall IT security, and being able to work with the CEO and the board was seen as essential to their success. These CIOs often engaged in simulated threats, surprise inspections, utilized external experts to come in and analyze things, taking into account, as we said, that uniqueness of the company's business model and industry in those threat and vulnerability assessments and so on. So these are, sort of background essential understandings. But one of the things that really changes when it comes to mobile, of course, is the fact that in the past we had this approach to the hardening of IT assets, where we would protect a data center with physical security measures that made sense, because all of the information was centralized, stored in a data center, and if we could keep people from accessing it, keep information from coming in or out that wasn't supposed to, then in a very real sense, security could be maintained. Now, that is just impossible with mobile devices, because the fact of the matter is that mobile devices will be lost and stolen, and initially we saw organizations putting all kinds of penalties, and there are some regulatory penalties that are in fact in place for losing devices and things like that if they have data on them. But the really smart approach to this is to plan for the certainty of loss, so that you know that the mobile device is going to be lost eventually or stolen at some point. What do you do then? How do you deal with it? How do you prepare in advance of that, for that certainty? How do you react to the loss of a specific device when that takes place? And this is where the whole world of mobile device management starts to come in to play, and then enterprise mobility management, if you will, where we look at being able to have capabilities for inventory and asset management, remote lock and wipe. You need to have the ability to manage rogue applications and known applications in the environment, create an enterprise data boundary so that personal information and enterprise information are not being mixed and can be protected, take into use tactics like geofencing, real-time roaming notifications, persistent logging and audit trails of what's going on, and all these capabilities of MDM help in the achievement of one's enterprise security plans and really adapting them to what's going on in the modern mobile IT environments that we're all suddenly finding ourselves in. But it's also important to look at the apps themselves and ask if they have provisioned properly for application level security, for user authentication, for user rights, for encryption and decryption. And we would identify these three as being very highly important. And with encryption and decryption, for example, you have choices between these various methods, and it's important to have those choices because different encryption approaches have strengths and weaknesses. Some perform very well in terms of speed of performance operation. They have less overhead, but they might not be quite as secure. The amount of time that it takes to crack them is shorter. So depending upon your situation, and the security threats that are most likely to be waged against your kind of data and information, you need to kind of decide, are we just dealing with an annoyance factor in terms of the attempted security breaches here? That might indicate one type of encryption, or is this life and death, financially, is there huge financial risks associated with the loss of information or the exposure of information and so forth. So the encryption and decryption method may need to be stronger, but therefore take more processing time. So those are choices. Now, when it comes to integration, what we found with these CIOs is that they were looking at integration from the standpoint of being able to overcome the differences between the APIs that had to be used in order to integrate their various back-end applications and mobile apps and so on. And so there were a lot of different protocols out there, but these protocols, and data formats of the various applications and so on were not based on a common data dictionary. So data transformation needed to occur. and so forth. And so the areas where we saw these CIOs really making sure that their organization had capabilities in place or in terms of event-driven architecture so that you could have real-time triggering between a mobile activity and an enterprise activity and bidirectionally so that the interface was real-time and not excessively batch-based to the point where you would have information latency that would be considered negative to the operation of that particular mobile application. Secondly, the need, as I mentioned, for data transformation, the ability to work with all kinds of data types, flat files, XML, SQL databases, to be able to work with variables and the operational metadata that is associated to both applications and the integration process, ability to create user-defined storage as a part of an integration process, and so on. All of that needs to be able to be mapped and transformed, and therefore an expression editor capability and a data mapper that includes numeric, string, logical functions, and operators is key, because if you have that at a very straightforward level but powerfully, then you can avoid line-by-line programming, and so they tend to look for platforms with this kind of capability. Thirdly, they were looking for the ability to deal with the various protocols. We sort of hinted at a couple of those protocols, but not all back-end systems use the same API protocols even. They have an API, but the protocols are different. Some use SOAP-based web services. Some use RESTful web services, which are very different. Some use messaging queues. Some use application logic itself, .NET, COM, JUE objects, etc., Java objects, Java classes. And then there are other transport protocols, EDI, HTTP, FTP, and so forth, that can be used in different ways from what we've previously discussed. So all of these various protocols need to be supported in a way by the platform that you can overcome the dissonance, as we said, between the various systems, the ERP system, the CRM system, the supply chain management system, and so on. And then the fourth thing that these CIOs looked for in an integration platform was this capability for communicating and visualizing what was going on in the integration process. So a very visually oriented system for mapping, a very visually oriented system for creating integration flows between the mobile apps and the back-end systems is also found. Now, when we're working with mobile APIs, we find that there are three categories of what people typically refer to or call a mobile API. And the first category is the most obvious one, which are the APIs that run on the mobile clients themselves. This would be something like a signature capturing API that allows an application that you've written for your mobile client to call an API that does the signature scanning and so forth. Barcode scanning might be another example of that. Now, a mobile server-side API would be something that is working with the server side of the mobile application and is giving it capabilities so that you don't have to write that from scratch. You just call the API, and SMS communications might be an example there. So you might have an SMS API that you're utilizing. It's utilizing an SMS server that's associated to your application, but not necessarily a part of the application per se. You've simply integrated it using an API. And then thirdly, there are sort of enterprise-wide APIs that have to do with things like geolocation, GPS, and so on, that can be used by any enterprise application in the environment. So we wanted to share a little bit about Salesforce and SAP specifically today, although this is really a general discussion of all types of enterprise systems. But these two seem to come up a lot. People ask, does Salesforce have an API? And of course the answer is yes. has a SOAP API, REST API, bulk API, metadata. And so to use the SOAP, you need to use the Salesforce CRM Enterprise Edition, the Performance Edition, the Unlimited Edition, or the Developer Edition. And the SOAP API conforms with SOAP 1.1, WSDL 1.1, the WSI interoperability basic profile 1.1 as well, and a metadata-driven API platform such as the Magic XPI integration platform will offer components that work with the SOAP, the REST, the bulk, and the metadata APIs. On the SAP side, SAP obviously also has a set of APIs. These are often proprietary API standards such as SAP's BAPI, RFC, ABAP, and IDOC, and as well as with some versions have SOAP web services and XML integration. Most all the newer and all of the newer environments do. So sometimes people say, well, which Salesforce API should we use? And I think the SOAP API is a good general purpose API, and the others tend to be used in more particular circumstances. So the REST API might be best in scenarios where less API metadata overhead is desired. And the bulk API is obviously used, as the name would imply, for high volume bulk transactions. The metadata API is used when a system has been heavily customized. It's where that tends to come into place. So an adapter such as the Salesforce component in Magic XPI simplifies this management of these APIs by consolidating functions in a single component, which is used in a visual process design environment rather than manipulated by line-by-line programming code that you would otherwise have to write in order to work with these APIs and intermediate between them. Now, on the SAP side, the question of which is best really often depends upon your release of SAP, where you're at. For non-NetWeaver-based releases, these are much older versions, but there are many of them still out there. Then BAPI, RFC, ABAP, and IDOC are likely to be chosen as the most suitable API or interface methods. And with the releases for NetWeaver, starting with NetWeaver 6.4 or ECC 5.0 and above for sure, then we'll often see web services being used. And that's typically the decision tree that people are looking at, and there's a lot more details to that decision tree, which a good consultant, of course, can sit down and help you decide on that. So if you're looking at an integration platform, then the question is, well, what capabilities in order to do Salesforce and SAP and other enterprise software integration would be needed in order to expose all of that to a mobile application that you're going to be running in your environment? And so the integration platform capabilities supporting that mobile app need to have the ability to publish and subscribe web services and be able to respond to the Salesforce SOAP, REST, bulk, and metadata APIs. You need to be able to transform and format XML. You need to be able to work with BAPIs, ABAPs, and IDOCs, or NetWeaver and XAPI versions. These have changed, of course, the naming conventions. The ability to composite application logic, including Java classes, Java objects, COM, C, and C++, may come into play in many situations as well. And the ability to simply monitor directories, parse text files, perform basic CRUD operations on text files can also be very powerful. So you want to have a business process modeler, as we have suggested. You want to have an event-driven architecture, as we've suggested. Be able to do the data mapping and transformation. But also, one thing we haven't mentioned up to this point is the ability to do the business process monitoring, to be able to have dashboard views of how the processes are executing, as well as the logging of all of that, including the ability to customize attachments that contain the actual data that was transferred as part of that process. So compliance with security requirements, as we suggested, is important, and including the ability to deploy your integration platform behind the firewall in most instances on-premise or in a public cloud. you want to have that scalability, and we'll talk more about how we're achieving scalability in a moment. And then SOA compliance is also something that people commonly look for with a technology an adapter library that allows you to expose all business processes as web services in a service-oriented fashion. And then ultimately, of course, for mobile, we need to be able to support those multiple mobile platforms that we or our customers might be using, whether that's Apple's iOS or Android operating systems, BlackBerry, Windows, and so on. So these are the things that we look at in the integration platform. What about in terms of scalability for our mobile apps, scalability for our integration system that's handling our mobile apps? Well, here we want to look at the areas of elastic partitioning to achieve dynamic scaling. We do that through an in-memory data grid, co-location of memory and processing, and we do that with mirror services and right behind. So dynamic scaling is really the idea of what we're after. We're trying to achieve this by being able to work with a grid of spaces that allows us to have very high-scale parallel processing of processes, so that any time a process needs to be executed, it can be handled. It doesn't have to wait or queue in a linear or serial fashion. Co-location is then how that in-memory data grid works. So it uses some memory and some processing power from the available physical and virtual environments in order to handle all of the processing that's needed. Now, this is kind of a procedure that's going to reduce the number of network hops and the overhead, the serialization and deserialization of information. So co-location has this advantage of reducing transport requirements and therefore aiding in the elasticity of your overall platform environments that undergird the mobility, the mobile applications, and the integration to enterprise systems. Now, mobile applications often run on the mobile devices, but what we're talking about here, of course, is the server side of those mobile applications. Even if it's an offline application, there's still synchronization with server-side resources in a multi-user environment, of course. So the third thing that makes this scalability happen is within memory computing is the concept of write behind. So whereas in the past, the overall process included the time that it took to record the transaction to the SQL database, the physical database on a hard disk, now within memory techniques, that is not a part of the transaction time. The transaction time takes place solely in memory, and through a process called write behind, the in-memory data grid then takes its time to record to back up the recording of the transaction. So the transaction occurs in memory completely. Because of that reliability, we're not worried about that information going anywhere. We have redundancy and fail-safe capabilities there. So there's such a high degree of reliability, up to and exceeding the reliability of physical hard disk databases that they can be used simply as an archival approach, similar to the way we would have viewed tape backup procedures in the past. So now let's back to our mobile discussion here. What these CIOs also looked for very closely was offline applications, because they understood that some applications only work best in online mode, some environments and approaches, and one of the great advantages of for them was this idea of having their applications always on, so that you could have an application that was written and designed to work offline, one that was written and designed to work online. with the availability of server interaction. And it wouldn't matter if you lost communication. It wouldn't matter if you were in a tunnel or if you were on airplane mode. Once communications were reestablished with the server, then a synchronization process could take place. And we'll look at that today. And so we won't go into the details of the ideas behind this, but synchronization approaches, offline approaches, are going to require special modes that handles startup of the offline mode. The authentication of users when you're offline is a different issue and needs to be handled. The ability to work with the local resources, the storage, and so on the device. The ability to synchronize once communications have been reestablished with the server, and what is the business model and approach that you want to use. Is this a master-slave data relationship, or more likely a master-master synchronization rule? And so you need to identify what those best practices are for your particular application, and that is going to be a decision that's available to the developer typically, and what we found in these offline approaches for synchronizing both application data and metadata. Now, the next thing that these CIOs looked at was, how do we deal with all the skill sets that are required here? Because on the surface, there are just too many programming languages involved with all of these mobile devices. You have the server-side language, plus you have client-side languages that may need to be used. And so you can overcome this, and these effective CIOs were finding ways to do that, so that they could, for example, with Magic's Enterprise Mobility Solution, use a single skill set. And that was viewed as a very highly effective kind of approach. So let me just back up and maybe explain what you're going to see in the demonstration a little bit. You'll see how you can build a mobile application using the Magic XPA application platform for multiple target environments. You'll see integration. We'll talk about how you can integrate to back-end systems, and how we won't demonstrate this, but part of that end-to-end solution, we also offer the Magic's mobile device management solution, and we have a full set of professional services. So from full strategy to execution, we're prepared to work with you as a partner and collaborator, and filling in those gaps that you might have in any of those areas. So in terms of MDM, when you look at the requirements there, there were three things that really stood out. First was reliability of the MDM itself, and mobile availability often needs to be very high. And so the first thing that people looked at is what is the service level that's being offered with this MDM offering. And that was one of the first factors. One of the other factors is the MDM customizable. So if you're going to have requirements that are not cookie cutter, and I don't know very many companies that truly are cookie cutter, so if you're going to have requirements that require some customization of the MDM, then you're going to want to select an MDM vendor who's willing to do that, who has the ability to do that. And for some organizations, that may be a make or break issue. So ask, can this be customized? Can you help us customize it? These kinds of questions. And then also just do the capabilities of that MDM fit with your overall governance policies and strategy. The MDM system shouldn't shape your strategy as much as your strategic requirements for security governance should shape which MDM tool you use. So these are some of the approaches to evaluation that we saw these CIOs using as they went forward. So what we want to do now is actually offer the demonstration. So I'm going to change the presenter to Andy so that he can share his desktop with us. And when we see his desktop, then we'll know that he's ready to begin today's demonstration. So Andy, I'm going to turn over the mic to you, and thank you for joining us.
All right, no problem. Thanks, Glenn. So as Glenn mentioned, today we're going to be going over a couple of items in the demonstration. The first item that I'd like to go through is creating a mobile application using our XPA Studio, and kind of just going through the process of what's required in order to develop an application from scratch and then to deploy it to our mobile devices. Today we'll be using an Android emulator. We'll be emulating a Nexus 7 tablet. And then also on the agenda today, after creating the mobile application, we're going to take the application offline and briefly go over the sync processes and kind of what kind of customization or what kind of flexibility we have with sync processes, depending on what the customer needs and how often the technicians or field agents will be syncing back to the server. After going through the sync processes, we're going to go ahead and go into our back-end integration. Today we will be demonstrating integrating with a Salesforce CRM. And after going over the back-end integration, we'll also be taking a look at one of our MDM solutions, which is SODI Mobi Control, and what kind of features using an MDM solution provides with its users. So on the screen we can see we have our Magic XPA Studio. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. I'll call this Project Accounts. And we have our blank project. Now, for the sake of time, I've went ahead and prepared a couple of style sheets that I'm copying from a directory. And basically what I mean by style sheets is when developing the screens and the GUI for the applications, I have some preset form sizes for our Nexus 7 devices. That way we don't need to spend any time on this demonstration to adjust and make sure that the application is fitting the screen correctly. Now when we create a new project with our XPA Studio, inside of our XPA root directory, we create a new folder for this project. So here we can see my accounts folder was created. I'm going to go ahead and copy in my style sheets, and I'll go ahead and go into back into my studio, go into the import wizard, and go ahead and import my properties and styles. So here I have a couple models I can use. The one I'm looking for mainly is just our form first design. So what is this application going to do today? This application is just going to have a simple browse on a MS SQL data table. My first screen is just going to be a simple welcome screen, which will contain 2 buttons, which will provide me with the functionality to view records within my MS SQL table. Now, as I mentioned before, our first screen is going to be our first version of this application we're creating today is going to be an online application. By definition, it's going to be online because we're going to be directly accessing the MS SQL server. So I'm going to create a rich client application, and we'll create a variable, welcome. In my forms, I'm going to go ahead and designate one of the models that I imported earlier, form first design. And as you can see, I have my background image and my screen size. Simply, I'm going to create a button, and I'm going to call it View Accounts Server. I'm going to go ahead and expand the button size. I'm going to use my command to center the button, and I have an empty button. I'll also go ahead and just add a quick banner at the top of the screen. I'll go ahead and say, welcome to XPA. Playing around with a couple of the properties in the properties pane, I can go ahead and play with the adjustments. I can center the text. I can recenter the entire object on the form, and I can go ahead and expand it, make it a little bigger. Handle into center again. Okay, so far on a GUI level, I've created a welcome banner and a button. Also, one thing I'd like to point out is that when creating applications, XPA uses the native languages of mobile devices to create these mobile applications. And what I mean by saying that is, although right now you see this button, which appears to be a Windows OS button, when we deploy it to an Android device, this Android will take on the native look and feel of the Android operating system. So if we pay attention, and I'll point it out once we deploy to our Nexus 7 device, when we run this application, it won't appear to be a Windows 7 or a Windows button, but rather an Android button. So speaking of the button, I've created an empty button, and now I need to assign it an event. I'm going to go ahead and create a new user event. I'll call this event View Accounts. There's no trigger. And just like that, I've designated what event to be raised or thrown when this button is pressed. Now I need to define the event. I'm going to go into my Logic tab. I'm going to say I'm going to define an event, my View Accounts event, and I'm going to call a program. Now, currently we only have our welcome screen program, so I need to create another program for this program to call. Now this program that I'm going to be calling is going to be a table view of our accounts table. In order to view that data source, I need to create the data source. So going into our data repository, I'm going to go to Options, and I'm going to just go to Get Definitions. I'm going to go ahead and pick our Magic Demo database, and I only want one table from this database, and we're going to go ahead and choose Accounts Salesforce. Click OK, and we've imported the table definitions from that database. I'm going to go ahead and execute a browse on it to ensure that we have data, and we have one record. This is one sample record that I created. Okay, so now going back to the program to view this data, I'm going to go ahead and park on my data repository, on my data table. I'm going to press Control-G, which is our program generator. I'm going to generate a rich client program, and I'm going to select which columns I want to display in my table. In this case, I only want the first name and say the company. Now this is just a view on the record. I'm not editing any data. I'm not modifying any data. And for this program alone, we're only going to be viewing the data. Also in this program generator, I can assign what form to use. I'm going to use the same form or background that I used as my welcome screen. And I'll go ahead and call this View Accounts Server. Press OK. And we can see that a program was generated for me. Going into the forms, I'm going to go ahead and adjust my screen sizes so that it can fit within the screen. 20 for each column. And right here I'm just adjusting the width of the column and the width of the data field itself. Okay. Adjusting my screen back to the Nexus 7 width. Sorry. One second, I'm just readjusting the width of our columns. Okay, and we'll just call this 80. I'm going to go ahead and select my entire table object and center the object, and go ahead and press Escape. And going back to our welcome screen, I need to make sure that my button is now calling my newly created program. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and park on the outside of my programs. I'm going to run the checker and go to check syntax, or F8, and all my programs check out. Okay, so I have my welcome screen, and I have my first button, which we'll simply call my second program, my view accounts from the server, and it'll show me my single record. Let's go ahead and deploy it to our Android device. Going to Options and Interface Builder, I'm going to choose my Rich Client Deployment Wizard. This wizard is basically the user interface to create my application installation packages, whether it would be iOS, I would create my IPA file, or if I were to create an Android application installation file, it would provide me with the .apk file to install that application. We also support Windows desktop applications or RIA applications, as well as Windows mobile applications. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new instance. On this first screen, it's just application information, what the title of the application is, application description. This is all just kind of details about the application. On the next screen, however, this is my web server configuration. What I'm creating here with online applications is simply a client-side application that points to an application server. The application server is where our XPA server is hosted, and basically where it contains all the metadata that the client application will be observing and will be pointed to. So I'm pointing to my development server here. I'm going to go ahead and enter in the fully qualified name, dev2.magic-inc.com. And basically I'm pointing this APK file I'm about to create at my XPA application server. Going to the next screen, I have the application name, what the application name on the server will be. Basically, when I run the client application, it's going to look for this specific application name on my XPA server. So here I'll leave it as it is, application name. And under Start Program, this is where I designate which program is executed on application startup. In this case, I wanted my welcome screen. And I assigned it the public name of Start. Going to the next field, I can deploy to whichever devices I'd like to. This is where I designate which mobile platforms I'll be deploying to. In this case, I'll be choosing Android. And by selecting Android, I'm prompted to fill in extra information on where my Android ANT SDK is. We'll see that in the next screen. But for now, for this screen, I can also designate an application icon or a loading screen, loading splash screen. If left blank, it goes to the Magic default, which is the Magic logo and the Magic loading screen. Now, as mentioned before, since I selected Android, I'm prompted with an Android settings menu. Here's where I point to my SDK, my Android SDK folder. As I mentioned before, Magic XPA uses the native SDKs of its platforms in order to achieve that native OS look and feel. Navigating to my Android SDK, clicking OK. I then go to which platform I'll be running, which API level, which Android OS version. Today we're going to be running on API level 18 or Android OS 4.3. Going to go ahead and click Finish. And this is where in the background we start, in the background it's now creating that .apk file using the Android SDK. Now also, while this is created in the background, all application installation files are created in our XPA root directory under published applications. Now as you can see on your screen, we already have accounts starting to be created. We have our Android directory and our Windows desktop, the two selections that we chose. Furthermore, what we've done is we've configured our IIS our web requester to enable directory browsing on this folder. This is one of the deployment modes modes we use in order to kind of test and get the APK file to our devices quickly. Instead of having to plug our device in or emailing the APK file to the device, we can simply host it on our server, have our IIS enable directory browsing towards our published applications directory, and from there we can enter the URL to our server on the device and directly download the link. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and wait for the wizard to finish creating our .apk file. Okay, and as you can see, we have the URL here to access our APK. So now what we've done is we went ahead and created our client application, which will point to our application server. The last thing we need to do is build our application or create an ECF, which can be done at File, Create Cabinet, and create our cabinet file, which is basically the metadata that our XPA server uses in order to execute the application's logic. Last thing to do is to start the application server. I'll go ahead and choose Accounts. And once that has started up, we'll go ahead and move over to our Android Nexus 7 SDK, or Android emulator. So now, I'm going to go ahead and...
Andy, I was just noticing, so when you're talking about these various API levels, then those are, am I understanding correctly, those correspond to like Ice Cream Sandwich, Jelly Bean,
correct.
Kit Kat,
those are the Android mobile operating systems. You are correct.
Android mobile operating systems. So one of the nice things is that there's a lot of discussion on the fragmentation between different operating systems, you know, whether someone has iOS or Android or BlackBerry, but what I think it's important to point out here is that there's also fragmentation within an operating system based on versions. So having the ability to support and deploy to all of those is quite important and reduces a lot of effort on the deployment side. Okay, sorry for interrupting there.
Okay, so as you can see, we have an accounts directory created. I'm going to go ahead and navigate to our Android, and our APK file, which was generated just now, is in this folder. I'm going to go ahead and download. And as that download completes rather quickly, it should complete quickly, I'll go ahead and install the application. And once it's done, I'll go ahead and open the application. Now, we have our application and we have our one button. So I'm going to go ahead and click on our View Accounts. And as you can see, we have our one record as well as the 3 specific columns that we designated. So in the matter of about 15 minutes, we went ahead and designed an application from scratch and deployed it to our Android device. Now, the second item on our list is to take this application offline. Now, by default, if I were to run this if I were to take my device and switch it to airplane mode and try to run the application, currently the way the application is programmed is that it needs to access the server to download the metadata in real time. And I received this error, cannot access server. Switching back to non-airplane mode and going back to my development environment, I'm going to go ahead and edit my application to allow me to access this application offline and as well as use the application offline. Now, in order to do so, I'm going to go ahead and go into the program properties and select offline. Now, when I run the checker, I'm going to receive an error that I cannot call an online program, which is our browse server program, from an offline program. As I mentioned, by definition, we cannot do this simply because when we're offline, we can't access the server. So one way we handle that is we're going to create a global event in our main program and call it Global View Accounts Server. And we're going to call our program. Now what I'm doing here, instead of directly calling the program, I'm going to go ahead and raise an event and raise our global event. By doing this, it allows our application to check and see if we're online or offline. And if we're offline, it won't let us call the program. But if we're online, it'll go ahead and call the program. So now, what happens when we want to be able to view data while we're offline as well, not simply just open an application offline? As I mentioned, we are currently browsing on a MS SQL database. But if we were, Magic has utilized a new gateway in order to handle offline data handling, which is our local gateway. I'm going to go ahead and make a duplicate of my SQL database and go ahead and choose my local gateway. Furthermore, I'm going to go ahead and change the settings of each column to allow for default storage. The reason I'm doing this is in case there's any data type mismatches, the application will know to simply use the default storage type. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and label this local. I'm going to go ahead and label this table local for reference sake. And just like before, I'm going to go ahead and create a browse on this table. So generate rich client, I only want my 3 columns, which is first name, last name, and company. And I'm going to go ahead and assign my style sheet. Okay. Now, going into the application, let's go ahead and adjust our table so that everything fits within the screen. Adjusting 20 and the table. Center. Okay. All right, and the last thing to do is create a button that will call this new program that we've created. I'm going to go ahead and create a copy of this button. We'll call this local, and we'll create a new event for it. View accounts local. Okay. And I'll go ahead and define the event, view accounts local. And now, since this is accessing our local database, which is on the device, we can access it offline. And since we can, an offline application can call an offline application can call another offline application instead of having to go through the main program, create a global event to call the program. We can simply call it directly. Here I'm going to go ahead and make the application offline. Okay, so what do we have? We have an application that's browsing two tables. Now, currently, the local table has no way of being synced, so we need to create a sync application. A sync program. And simply what we're going to do is we're going to copy our MS SQL server's data into our local table. I'm going to choose non-interactive, which is the equivalent to a batch task. I'm going to go ahead and main source my MS SQL table. Selecting all the columns, so we copy all the columns to our new table. And in our task suffix, I'm going to go ahead and evaluate an expression. And the expression we're going to be using is our data view to data source. And basically what this is saying is data view to data source, I'm going to take the data view of my main source, which is the server, and copy it over to my local database. I'm going to run the checker. Everything checks out. We're going to create a new global event. Since this is a sync process, that requires it for the application to be online. I call my sync to client program, and I'm going to create a click button on my welcome screen. Call this button sync, create a new event, sync. Going into my logic, I'll go ahead and define the event, sync, which raises the event to sync. All right. Go ahead and run the checker. No trigger. Okay. Now, I built a new application. What do I need to do? Instead of creating a new APK, as I mentioned before, the client application we created is simply a pointer to the application server. Since we haven't changed the name of the application, we can leave it how it is, I'm going to go ahead and restart my servers, my application servers. Start by accounts. And going into my application, we're going to go ahead and see that my new buttons are there. If I go ahead and click View Accounts Local, we're going to see an empty table. Now, once I press Sync, it's going to go ahead and check to see that we have connectivity and sync our two servers. Going back into our View Accounts Local, we can see that my record was synced. Now, one last test is to make sure that everything is offline. I'm going to go ahead and go back into airplane mode. My application started, and I can still view my local table. Okay. So we took an application, we created an application, and we took it offline. Now, when it comes to the sync process, I created a manual sync process. Depending on what solution is required by whichever system our customers are deciding to implement, we can either do automatic syncs, which happen on an interval of time or after something's created. Basically, the flexibility of the sync process is one single command. On more complex and on more high traffic servers, we utilize the timestamp attribute in order to sync. All right. The next item on our webinar is to go over our integrating to Salesforce. What I'm opening now is a demo application we created for a pharmaceutical company for their technicians to go out to the field and create orders or contacts and add them into Salesforce. I'll go ahead and go into contacts. Now, what this application is actually doing is it's calling an XPI HTTP service, which uses our Salesforce component in order to add it to our Salesforce account. So quickly going to our add contact, I'm going to go ahead and fill in some data. John. And right now I'm just adding some sample data, making sure to avoid any duplicate entries. Okay, and we'll say webinar, and we created it at 11:55. Okay. Now going into the menu, we've also configured our XPI project to allow us to integrate into other CRM and other systems as well. Today we're interested in Salesforce, so I'll go ahead and choose Salesforce and click Save. I'll be prompted with a verify, which will just kind of go over what information will be being passed, and also this HTTP service that we set up on our XPI servers is using a RESTful API. This is basically the RESTful API we'll be calling. Click OK. And we'll be provided with a Salesforce ID number. Going to XPI, this is the XPI project. Here we have our HTTP trigger, which when called will decide which application to use, in our case Salesforce. And as you can see, we have our Salesforce component, which will map our parameters to their designated positions. I think I might have created a duplicate entry. Let me go ahead and go through and create the contact one more time. Three. Say LA. And this will be created at 11:59. Oops, sorry, Salesforce. All right, and we have our Salesforce ID. It's at 00382345-1CTCQGAAU. Now quickly copying this ID over to our Salesforce page, we can see that Justin Wilson was created at 11:59 today. All right, I believe we are out of time. The last item that I wanted to go over was our MDM solutions, but throughout I believe we will be doing other systems, Glenn, for our mobility.
We can certainly take that offline with anyone who wants to take a look at the MDM solution as well, and we'll have other webinars that will be specifically MDM oriented, I'm sure. So thank you very much, Andy. Let's open it up for questions from the audience. If you would like to enter a question into the chat box or the questions panel, we'll be happy to answer those at this time. One that came in was, when building your apps, can you use pre-existing HTML5?
Pre-existing HTML5. I haven't gotten that inquiry before. It's a good question. I'll probably need to take it offline and get back to you, but it is an excellent question. I believe we do support that, but I haven't looked into it before.
Okay, so that sounds like that would be like the hybrid mode where they can use HTML and native at the same time.
Correct.
Should apps work in offline mode and only go online when needed, or is online the best default?
As I mentioned before, it depends on the solution that we require. Normally when we do take an application offline, the entire application is offline in that once it's checked in with the server for the first time, to download the metadata to the device, it never needs to connect again. But when we want to take data from the device and send it back to the server, that's when we have our online features. In terms, I guess the question kind of gears towards, is there a hybrid version of the application? We can't implement that, but normally when we decide to go online or offline, it's normally towards the extremes.
Okay. And what type of server, OS, RAM requirements, etc., is needed?
I believe that is under our documentation for XPA. I'm not sure of the numbers right off the bat. I can get, once again, take this question offline, but all it is reading through some documentation to find the system requirements.
And in terms of operating system, it's what, Windows, Linux, etc. on the server side?
For XPA servers, I believe it's Windows, yes, and I think we support
Linux, IBMI,
yeah.
and some Unix environments.
Yeah. Once again, that's in the system requirements.
Yeah.
If we'd like, we can send out the link to the requirements after this.
Sure. Okay. Very good. I appreciate the questions. Oh, and then someone asked, was the local database SQLite or XML?
It's a subversion of SQLite. Not exactly SQLite, but a subversion of SQLite.
Okay. Great. See if there's any others coming in here. No, that looks like it. So I want to thank everyone again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on another Magic Software webinar.
Right, thanks.